So how much does it cost to fly to the Philippines to meet your long-distance relationship if you're on a budget? People are usually surprised that I've traveled to the Philippines twice this year to spend time with my fiancée. I've heard estimates from subscribers that this should cost $10,000 to $20,000 for a 3-week trip. But I don't have that kind of disposable income, so I'll show you exactly how much it cost me and where the money went for 2 different trips to the Philippines that were 3 weeks each. Let's start with my first trip. I flew into Manila, went to visit Joy's family, passed through Dumaguete, Cebu, and ultimately went to Siargao before returning back to Manila. So the most expensive thing is the plane flight there, and this is actually a pretty cheap round-trip ticket through China Airlines, who's usually the cheapest. And I also bought it about 3 months in advance. And I tried to save money by flying out of Los Angeles instead of Salt Lake City, but that ended up costing me more because I had to drive and spend a lot of money on gas and hotels and snacks and food. And they were still forcing everyone to take COVID tests who hadn't had the vaccines yet. So I had to do that, and it took me about 2 days to actually fly out, and then another 24 hours of flying, and the trip home was about the same. So at the end of the trip, I ended up spending about $1,620. That would have been probably cheaper if I just would have flown out of my local international airport for about $1,400 to $1,500. But that's not all, because we had to pay for some island hopping flights in order to visit different places. Here are the prices that these flights cost, and they were purchased about 2 months in advance. But honestly, Joy paid for these, and she didn't want me to pay her back, so I'm not going to include this number into my budget. Joy had been saving up for years to go on a vacation, so this trip was as big of a deal for her as it was for me, and she wanted to show me that. I think she secretly wanted us to stay in Siargao forever because she didn't buy a plane ticket back. That's okay though. The only flight I paid for was our trip from Siargao back to Manila, and it ended up costing me a lot more, only because I bought it just a couple days before we were flying out. The next big expense was lodging. Before we continue, I just want to say thanks for subscribing. We just passed 10,000 subscribers today, and it gives me hope that I can actually get out of the snow. So if you like our vlogs, please subscribe and share so I can get back to the Philippines. The next big expense was lodging. Now, I'm not the type of guy that wants to spend lots of money on fancy hotels, but Joy kept being worried that I was not going to be comfortable there. And so the things we always looked for was air conditioning and a clean place that was safe without spending too much money. I booked in advance a 2-bedroom apartment near the Mall of Asia in the Sea Residence that only came out to be about a little over $50 a night. It was beautiful and very comfortable, and I was able to make sure I didn't have any jet lag before we took off. The next place was a fancy little resort in the province that was set up by our parents. The next place was in Cebu, or Lapu-Lapu City. I got a really good deal on Booking.com for a couple nights there. I used Booking.com to lock in a place at Eddie's Resort in Siargao for 2 nights, and then the next 3 nights we paid in cash and got a discount. And finally we went back to Manila and got another place at the Sea Residence again, which brought me to the total of about $584 in lodging. And I booked a lot of these places just a couple days before we got there. Next up, I wanted to talk about how I was able to send my money to the Philippines to use, instead of just bringing a bunch of American dollars and then having to figure out how to convert them and get charged the conversion fees and all that stuff. The banking system is just really different there, and a lot of people use either just pesos or GCash, which is on your phone, but you have to register your SIM card with the government in order to have a working phone, so I didn't want to do that. But after building a lot of trust in our relationship and seeing just how good Joy was with money, I decided to send her a chunk of money through PayPal so that she could pull it out and have it as pesos in cash, and then also some in GCash on her phone. I sent her this money for our travels about a week before I arrived in the Philippines, and honestly, this was kind of a test. I knew she could handle a lot of money because she was always in charge of the money at her jobs wherever she worked, and they really trusted her. So I figured, can I trust her with my money as well? If the trust failed here, then I figured the relationship would be over, and this was a good test. Luckily, she passed with flying colors. It turned out to be a huge benefit to have her carrying the money in pesos, because then I didn't get the skin tax that every foreigner would get going over there. Instead, she was doing the negotiating, she was paying, and she just knew the value of her pesos better than I did. And she was able to use GCash on her phone to book rides through Grab and all that stuff. I would have spent double or triple or quadruple the money probably if it was just me walking around trying to pay for things with my own money. But eventually that chunk of money did run out, and I tried to use my debit card or credit cards to pull out money out of an ATM. I had trouble with my credit card, but my debit card did work in a specific ATM machine. The problem is, when you're in the province, you just don't have many places to go to get money out. So we always tried to pull out money and have it on hand. But because I had internet almost everywhere we went, the easiest way seemed to be sending her money through PayPal for her to pull out and have as cash for wherever we went. Now I know there's other ways to do this that might be better, and we've tried using other cash transfer apps, but none of them seem to work as good or easily as this for Joy's situation. And keep in mind that Joy is probably a little more tech savvy than most Filipinas, and so that's one of the reasons it was able to work for us this way. But if you guys have any suggestions for better ways to transfer money internationally, we would love to hear them. Anyway, the total cash I sent Joy through PayPal was this, and then the total cash I pulled out with my debit card was this, along with the fees, making the total cash that I handed Joy to be my secretary on our trip this. So, I know what you're probably thinking. What did Joy spend this money on? Well, let's look. First of all, realize this cash was used for many of the things we already talked about, like lodging. About half of the places we stayed, we actually spent our cash in the form of pesos to stay there. And annoyingly, I was told I needed to get swab tests before I flew from Manila and before I flew back home. But none of those were necessary, so it was just a waste of money and super annoying. About $50 for a week's worth of food and breakfast at Eddie's Resort, a motorcycle rental for the week. We bought gas for a family friend and paid him to drive us to and from the airport, which was about an 8-hour round trip. Remember that flight I had to pay for to get back to Manila? Joy paid for that in Gcash. We also paid for surf lessons in Siargao with 2 instructors and a cameraman and 2 surfboards for 2 hours each, making a grand total of the things I can add up about $1,000. And all the things I can't add up because they're small and we just paid for it in cash with pesos are things like trike rides that were about $2 to $3 per ride. We also paid a little bit more to Kuya in Cebu because he acted as our personal driver that day. So I think we paid him about $15 to $20. Whenever Joy would book a Grab or we would get a van, we would usually spend about $6 on average per ride, sometimes more, sometimes less. Local foods at cantinas, street vendors, or some fast food restaurants was about $1 to $3 per person. The rest of the things are just random things we would get, and we didn't really deny ourselves anything. We just, we weren't really big spenders. We didn't go out and drink. We didn't do a lot of nightlife type stuff, but we didn't hold back. If we wanted to go do something, we went and did it. And Joy was always hesitant, but I was the one who kept pushing her to spend money because I'm like, hey, I'm here, let's go do things, let's go spend money. And the total of that kind of stuff was about $881. And then when I left, I gave her about $200 in unused cash, which was part of this total. And I did happen to use my credit card a couple times for some restaurants and random things. And so that brings me to the total of the first trip to the Philippines. Just getting there and back home was $1,600, and then the total money spent there was about $2,300, at a total of $3,924. But I promised you guys the totals for 2 trips to the Philippines, so here is the totals from the second trip to the Philippines. You'll notice that I spent a little less money on traveling to and from the Philippines by just flying out locally, spending a little bit more for the ticket, but it was an easier trip to get there. And then I spent just a little bit more money while in the Philippines. We did a lot more tour stuff this time, coming in about $100 less than the first trip. Now, I wasn't really planning this budget. I wasn't saying to myself, I'm going to do this trip for less than $4,000. I really had no idea how much it would take. I kind of thought I spent less money than this, but now that I add it all up, I realize it's about $4,000 for a 3-week trip. Now, I happen to know a couple other people who've taken a similar trip, and they've spent about twice as much money as this. So I think it really just depends on what you're doing, what you like doing, how much money you like spending. If you want to do all the tours, if you want to go drinking and partying and clubbing and go to all the trendy places to go and stay in all the places that are very touristy, you're going to spend a lot more money than this. But this is what I spent, and I really enjoyed the trip with Joy.